What do an unmarried, pregnant 15-year-old girl, two midwives, a seamstress, and a princess have to do with each other? They're not the punchline of some terrible pastor joke that I'm about to tell, so don't worry. But they are all characters in God's story of liberation. And today we're beginning an 8-week series looking at that story of liberation and hopefully finding our place within it, specifically as told through the book of Exodus. Now, if you, like me, grew up going to Sunday school, you probably learned about the book of Exodus mostly as the story of Moses. And while Moses certainly figures very prominently into this story and is an important figure in our canon, he's not the only actor. He's not the only character in God's story of liberation. Now, as we begin this story, we learn about a whole host of other people who are working for that liberation well before Moses is even able to participate. And we find a tyrannical king oppressing God's people in the land of Egypt. So I want to back up so that we understand how we got into this situation of God's people being in Egypt and being under this tyrannical king. So if we go back into the book of Genesis, we have the story of Joseph, who is sold into slavery by his brothers into the land of Egypt, but then rises to prominence as an advisor to the king. And then because of his position of prominence, is able to bring his people out of their land and into Egypt when there's a famine. The people are able to live and thrive there. They lean into God's command to be fruitful and multiply in this land, and everything seems to be at peace. But then Joseph dies, and a few generations pass, and there's a new king, a new Pharaoh. And this new Pharaoh doesn't know who Joseph is. He's forgotten the past. He's forgotten what an important and helpful figure this was, and how the Israelites are people that were in need, people that were brought into the land to help save them. They've been there and they've multiplied, and this new Pharaoh looks around and he sees all of these people who are not Israelites like him, and he is afraid. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us which Pharaoh this is. It actually doesn't give him a proper name, and I think that's on purpose, because it doesn't matter which Pharaoh he is. The important thing is that Pharaoh, with a capital P, is the symbol of power that is rooted not in care for the people, not in liberation, but in fear of maintaining his own position. And this is a fear that drives this Pharaoh to commit genocide. So when we meet this Pharaoh finally in the book of Exodus, we see that he has sunk into this fear that rules him. And he gives the command for all of the midwives to kill the Israelite children. But then we meet Shiphrah and Puah, two midwives who refuse to go along with his order. And I love Shiphrah and Puah because they actually use Pharaoh's own racism against him. And as they are refusing to kill these children and he questions them about it, they tell him, well, these women, they're just not even human, how quickly they give birth. And Pharaoh seems to not question that at all. As the story progresses, we meet another woman, Moses' mother, a Levite woman. And Pharaoh now has changed his order, not to kill all the children, but just to kill the boy children. And when Moses' mother gives birth to him, she sees that he is a good and wonderful boy child, and she hides him. And when she can no longer hide him, she seeks to save him by sealing him in a basket and putting him in the river. And then we meet Pharaoh's daughter. And Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses, finds him in this basket, opens it up, and decides to take care of this child, apparently understanding that he is a Hebrew child. And as she takes care of him and is given permission to raise him, she goes and finds Moses' own mother to nurse him and even pays her for the work. And so Moses' mother is able to nurse and care for him as he grows. And Moses is raised in Pharaoh's own household in the company of a whole collection of women who have worked against Pharaoh's own commands, even from within his own house, to save his life. Now, I love the women in this story so much because even though they may not be in positions of power and prominence, even within their own household, they use what they have to work against Pharaoh's evil declarations, evil instructions to kill. We have the midwives who just refuse and then are tricky in the answer that they give back to Pharaoh. They use his own bias against him to justify their actions and to get out of trouble themselves. We have Moses' mother who just straight up refuses to kill her own children or to allow him to be killed. And then we have Pharaoh's daughter, who, while she is part of the system of power, she acts as an ally to raise up this child and also to lift up Moses' own mother, a woman from the Hebrew people, and to pay her for her labor. All of these people working together stop the evilness that Pharaoh is enacting against the Hebrew people and begin the trajectory of Moses himself as one of the leaders among this people. When I read this story of all of these people working together to counteract Pharaoh's evil deeds, I can't help but think of the story of the Montgomery bus boycott. And how, if you only learn about the Montgomery bus boycott in school, you would have the impression that there is one and maybe two characters in this story. You have Martin Luther King Jr., who is absolutely a hero of the civil rights movement. And you have Rosa Parks, who makes a stand against the injustice of segregated busing. But there's much more to the story of the Montgomery bus boycott than just these two heroes in it. Claudette Colvin, 9 months before Rosa Parks took her stand on a bus in Montgomery, was also arrested for refusing to give up her seat. The reason we don't hear about Claudette Colvin so much, even though she was part of a lawsuit that helped to overturn segregated busing, we don't hear about Claudette Colvin because she was young, and she was unmarried, and she was pregnant. And so because of the judgments of the white people in her society, she wasn't lifted up as a hero, even though she played a huge part as being part of this court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court and challenged Jim Crow laws. We know about that Rosa Parks' actions were not spontaneous. There was intense planning already underway in Montgomery through the NAACP and other organizations to get her to the position where she would take a stand and become the public symbol of the Montgomery bus boycott. There are so many people who were part of this story, who were part of the subversion of racist and evil laws that kept our African American siblings living as second-class citizens in America. The story of liberating God's people, whether they are God's people in Egypt or God's people in Alabama, whoever God's people are, the story of their liberation is not the story of a single hero. It's the story of many people using who they are and what they have to do the work of liberation, to stand up in the place that they inhabit, to get into, as John Lewis often said, to get into good trouble. It takes a community. It takes people from all walks of life, whether they be midwives or princesses, using what they have, using the place where God has put them, and coming together to be part of the story of liberation. If we only focus on heroes in these stories of liberation, if we only focus on Moses, then we miss that God is calling us to participate in liberation too. If we think that we have to wait for one big person to lead us into a movement towards freedom, then we will miss that God is already doing that work, already moving towards freedom here and now in our place. If we are people of privilege and we stand back and wait for a single hero to emerge for us to get on their side, if we wait for a perfect movement that we can agree on to get into the trenches, to get into the work of liberation, then we will miss out that God is calling us into allyship, to use the privilege that we have in the moment that we are in and in the place where we live to be part of that liberating work. If we want to be Christians who care about being part of the story of God's liberation in our time and in our place, we have to understand that we are being invited into that work too. We may think that we live in Pharaoh's household, and indeed we do. But we can also choose to be Pharaoh's daughter. We can choose to be allies who lift others up in their work of liberation. We can choose to be allies who financially support that work, who lift up the voices of others, who take the baton and carry it to the next place, to the next runner. If we want to be part of God's work of liberation, then we have to understand that the time is now, that there are many people who are involved in this work, and we can be one of those people. So here's what I want to invite you to think about this week. Find yourself in this story. Find yourself in God's work of liberation here and now. And ask, what position do you have? What role do you play? How is God inviting you into this? To be one of the many, maybe not to be a hero, but to be one of the multitude that are part of the work of God setting all of God's people free.